Thank you. I'm Allie Weller, and I'm part of the AppleEarth group, and I'm a volunteer who has collaborated with Land Trust of Santa Cruz to organize a tree planting event. So I'm going to ask Carrie Thompson, who is the Access Director for Land Trust of Santa Cruz. Carrie, I have a question for you about Land Trust of Santa Cruz, which is, who is Land Trust of Santa Cruz, and why is tree planting important to you?
So the Land Trust of Santa Cruz is a conservation organization. We're actually pretty small, but we feel like we really punch above our weight. We get involved in a lot of conservation projects, from the wildlife tunnel to the coastal rail trail. We also do conservation easements on our property, and we buy high value conservation properties and steward them.
Oh,
So
okay.
the second part of your question is why we do tree planting.
Yeah.
So at this property today, we're at Antonelli Pond, which is one of the first properties that we ever purchased. So it is our property. We provide free public access at this pond. And when you provide free public access, sometimes in a very urban area, you get a lot of volunteer trails or trails that aren't sanctioned. So we're going to try to go out and we're going to plant some willows in those areas to try to rehab that riparian zone that's getting impacted by people.
So on a small local scale, we're repairing a riparian zone, and that's riparian zone. That's sort of where land and river and freshwater meet.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And what's vulnerable about that place?
So riparian areas are really important for conservation. A lot of birds tend to hang around this area. It's also important for wildlife, so you'll have a lot of nesting animals in the riparian zone. So yeah, we want to keep this really healthy, as healthy as we can.
Okay. And you know, at Apple, we really like to think about the details, the local, regional level, and then we also like to keep in mind the big picture. So I'm curious, for Land Trust of Santa Cruz, when you're focusing on this area here, this river, this pond, this small ecosystem, how does tree planting here figure into the bigger picture of the goals of, well, one thing that you and I talked about earlier was climate change.
So we protect a lot of properties that are high conservation value properties, and those things help mitigate the effects of climate change through carbon sequestration, and also provide opportunities for people to connect with nature, which I think has a tangible effect on the way that people view our world and our environment, and secondarily our climate, probably.
And you say it affects the way people view these issues. When a group like this comes together and gets involved in a project like tree planting, in your experience over the years, how does that change the community and how the community feels about environmental issues?
I think it really connects people to something very, like, they can come back in 5 years and they can see that willow that they planted, and they go, wow, it's grown up, and we did that. So it's something that they can do. I think a lot of people sometimes feel very powerless in the face of all of the problematic scenarios that we have in front of us, and I think giving somebody power to do something that's tangible is really great and important.
Yes. And I know that we're not the first organization that you've partnered with to do volunteer events like this. For our group, it's a fairly small group. We're planting willow stakes, which are native species, and then we're also pulling up invasive species.
That's correct, yeah.
And so how can you help us as a group relate to the importance of this project today and the longevity of the legacy it'll create?
I would like to bring Matt in and answer that question. I'll tell you my thoughts on that. So one of the things about willow staking is it's completely magical. We have willow stakes in our truck. They're a piece of willow that we've cut and stripped off, and you just stick them in the ground and they grow. So that's really quite something. The invasive plants that we're pulling today, we have a lot of non-native plants in here, and we can't get them all. But there is a difference between a non-native plant and an invasive plant. The invasive plants that we have here at the pond, they affect the trees, so they'll choke them off, and eventually those trees will die. So this project is about stewardship and about moving forward the conservation goals of this particular property.
And when those invasive plants outcompete the native ones, what happens? I know that the willow is evolved to thrive in a riparian zone like this, and so it does something special for the natural environment here that some of the invasive species can't do. What are some of those things?
Well, for bird nesting is one of the big ones. So the birds, the invasive species that we're pulling are more, they're ivy plants. So
Yeah.
they grow along the ground, they cover the area, and they don't provide any opportunities for wildlife to feed and or nest in the area.
Yes.
So willows are much preferable to that.
Yes. Okay. And also today this is a family event. So we have Apple employees who are coming as volunteers, and we have family members as
great.
well. So it's a whole family event. Do you do a lot of family events like this?
We don't actually do that many family events. Usually the people that show up for our events are adults, but I love working with kids, so, and I think they're the future of conservation, so we really need to connect them to nature.
And why do you think that's important for the future citizens to connect with nature?
I think, at least I can speak for myself, I grew up in northern Wisconsin and I was very connected to the outdoors, and that just planted a seed in me as, you know, for my life wanting to be involved in conservation, because it fed me and nurtured me in ways I can't really explain.
Yes. Okay, I've got a slightly longer question.
Okay.
This is just to understand a little bit better the land trust, and to understand what Land Trust actually has in common with the company that I work for.
Great.
So I noticed that, like Apple, you address many real world needs with many different approaches, and that you're committed to a lot of issues. So you're solving a lot of problems. You're offering a lot of different solutions. And some of the things that you're committed to as an organization are climate change, wilderness preservation and rehabilitation, historic farm conservation, which is another interesting thing we can talk about, even organic and biodynamic gardening, community building, and community leadership and engagement. So how do you prioritize projects, and what does the tree planting we're doing together today have to do with your main priorities?
Okay, so we have a guiding document, as most organizations do. So that document guides us in the projects we take on, which are many and very varied. So we have, like you said, we have an organic farm that we own and manage that we're building public access trails on. So we're not only providing food for the community through this farm, but we're also using that revenue to provide public access for people to connect to this farm and to connect to the birds in the slough where the farm is located. We have other properties that are sandhill conservation properties that we're just protecting the sandhills communities that are super at risk. We have a redwood forest properties where we're building trails. Same thing with the public access. Sometimes we do sustainable forestry on them that helps provide some funding for the conservation efforts we do there, and also for some public access. And so all of those lands that we own or we have conservation easements on or managements agreement with, we have a stewardship need there. So they don't just do well if you just leave them alone. You have to go in there and strategically fix some things or help some systems along to make them at their maximum sustainability.
Oh, I see. Okay, so if you were to choose, what is the one top priority that kind of connects all of those different initiatives that you just described? What do they all have in common?
Well, I think our mission is to protect the extraordinary places in Santa Cruz, and then to steward them, and then to connect people to them. So I think that's the overarching goal. And then within that construct, we take on a lot of projects that will further those goals.
Oh, okay. So your mission is to protect the extraordinary places in Santa Cruz.
Yep.
And what makes a place extraordinary? Like, what's extraordinary about Antonelli Pond?
So Antonelli Pond was one of the first properties that we got. It has a lot of conservation value, but maybe it's not the highest of our properties. But as you can see, it's an urban sort of center where people come, all these neighborhoods come and they connect to nature here. We have the UCSC campus here, so a lot of people are walking around here and fishing and connecting to this place.
So it's important that people are coming and they're using the place
Yep.
and caring about it actively. And because they love the place, they're motivated to protect it.
Yep.
And then
Hopefully.
when they protect
Yeah.
it, we have a carbon sink, we have a healthy ecosystem with animals and plants that might otherwise be at jeopardy.
Yeah, they could be developed out, right?
Ah.
Development pressures in Santa Cruz are very severe. So
Yeah.
any time that you can strategically purchase a property or put it in a conservation easement, that saves it from development pressures.
Yes.
And we need these places. This is, as you see, this area over here is going to be developed shortly. So there'll be a big housing community here, and this will be the last remaining spot in this main development around here where people can have a walk and contemplate nature and
Wow,
just
so
connect.
that makes the pond all the more precious.
I think
It's
so.
Basically, development is happening on all sides, and it's becoming like a little island for nature to thrive. Wow, then we're doing something very important
I
today.
think so, yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned easements, you mentioned land trust. Land trust is in your name. Apple is familiar with easements and land trusts. I'd like you to explain what is a land trust and what is an easement.
Okay, so most land trusts are conservation organizations that either purchase property outright to conserve the conservation values of that property, or they buy or are donated an easement on a property that is privately owned. So a private person maybe owns a big farm, as in the case of the most recent purchase that we did was the Martinelli's family's farm in Watsonville. I can't remember how many acres it is, but it's a large farm, and John Martinelli wanted to protect that property from development, so he sold us a conservation easement on that property. So that property is protected forever from development.
Okay. One last question for you. I've heard that Land Trust of Santa Cruz has a very interesting conservation approach to ensure that perfect doesn't get in the way of great. And I think that is a kind of a philosophy that I can relate to. Tell me what that means. In other words, my understanding is compromise isn't the enemy of conservation, and it's often only the way forward.
That's right, yeah. So because of the development pressures in this area, sometimes you may have a situation where somebody wants to develop a part of their property, but they want to set aside another part of their property for conservation. So, you know, in the perfect world, in conservationist minds, that would never happen. The development would never happen. But we really feel like that's a good compromise. We also feel like working forests are really important, that you know, people need these resources from the forest, and if you can go in there and build the forest to an old growth model or a very sustainable growth model, selectively harvest timber, that's a great thing for the forest. Most of these forests were logged in the 1900s, so they all have the same age trees on them. So going in there and thinning the trees out is good for the forest, good for the people, good for the environment. But I would say that there are conservationists that think, oh, you should never cut down a tree, or you should never touch something. So yeah, I think compromising that way and looking at the end goals is kind of our vision. We try to be on the cutting edge of conservation science, and we think that the future of conservation is connecting people to property. So you might have a conservation property, and you might sacrifice some of that to build a trail, but then you have all these other benefits from that.
Because people are now invested and they want to keep it
Yes.
the way it is. Yes. And I'm here, when you talked about thinning the trees, the first thing I thought about is that context is really important.
Yes.
Like the context that you just named is that some places the trees were all cut in the 1900s.
That's right, yeah.
And so
Most
when
of
they
this forest,
right, and so when they regrew, they're all the same age. And so then you don't have that 5-layer
You
succession.
don't have a healthy forest, no.
Right.
And then none of those trees can really grow into an old growth or a mature model, because they're all competing for the same resources.
Right.
They'll all be skinny and tall, in the case of redwoods.
Yes. And so in the planting that we're doing today with willows, are we contributing to something that may one day become a mature?
Absolutely, yeah.
Mature
Yeah,
forest,
we're hoping.
mature-
Yeah.
yeah.
So a lot of a lot of these volunteer trails, they end up kind of cutting through the willows. People actually, believe it or not, take chainsaws into our properties and cut areas out because they want to walk there. So we want to make sure we're providing a lot of trails. So we're actually building 50 miles of trails in the county right now. So
Yes.
we feel like we're providing the trails. we'd really like people to stay on the actual trails so we can conserve the rest of the property.
So we're actually going to plant right onto trails that people have come and just made.
That's right.
Without them being official trails.
Right.
So we're going to keep the trails that you've designated as trails, but we're going to close the volunteer trails that people have just plowed through.
Yes.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm excited.
If there's one most inspiring thing that you want our group to take away from today after participating in this event, what would it be?
I'd say just collaboration is really key. We, conservation organizations, parks, we can't do it alone. We need the support of groups, we need the support of our visitors, we need the support of the public. So collaboration is, and it's so fun to be in a collaborative relationship.
Yes. Last thing I'll say is that this is the last volunteer weekend of MLK month, and so for every hour that each of our volunteers donates today, the company is going to match 2 to 1. And so if we have 19, I think we're going to have 12 actual employees, and then we have their family members. So I think we'll probably raise about $2,400. Don't quote me on that because I don't know how many people will actually show up. But if we do raise that much, what does that amount of money actually represent to you as an organization? Like, what can you do with our match donations?
That's fantastic. Oh, there's so many things we can do. We have some projects right now that are big dollar projects, and then we have some more projects that are kind of smaller dollar projects. So yeah, it'll go into our fund to keep moving forward on all these great things that we're doing. I have to say, just as a personal person, I came to the Land Trust about 1.5 years ago, and before that I was a state park ranger, and I just think the Land Trust is amazing. They just really, if I can say it, they kick ass. Get a lot done for what a small staff we have. We get a lot accomplished.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So beyond this weekend, how can people get involved, the people of the community?
Yeah, they can just give me a call or get my email. They can sign up for our newsletter, and there's always ways that they can volunteer.
I'm Allie Weller, and I'm back with Matthew Timmer, who is the Natural Resource Manager for the Land Trust. And he's also an ecologist and an ornithologist.
Oh,
so
great.
We're going to get to learn about birds, and there's my people, Canada geese. My people, I'm Canadian.
Oh, good.
Lots of coots, Matthew.
Yeah, this is a local birding hotspot. When I moved to Santa Cruz County 17 years ago, this was one of the first places I would come bird watching. It has a variety of different habitats. You get water birds, perching birds. You get a lot of migratory birds during the fall and winter season. It's just a diverse diversity of habitats in a small space. It's a great spot for bird watching.
So we want to preserve this land. This pond itself, is this pond actually a land trust as well as the land all around it?
Right, so the Land Trust owns a parcel that includes the pond and then the riparian around it, and then some uplands habitat, some grassland as well.
Why are birds important in the way that birds and forest and the transition zone, the riparian area, why are birds important as a part of that ecosystem?
Birds serve a variety of purposes in an ecosystem. They disperse seeds, they eat insects, they keep insect populations intact. They're part of the whole food web of a system.
Not to mention that we love them.
They're fun to look at and listen to as well.
And do you find that as people are coming and volunteering with the Land Trust, that part of what they take away is that sense of wonder when seeing all the bird species?
Yeah, definitely. I think just that connection with nature. And birds are really accessible wildlife group. They're out during the day. A lot of them are out during the day, so they're easy to see and hear as opposed to other wildlife taxa.
I can tell that you're used to talking to the public about why birds that you love are important or have value, but I also know that you're an ornithologist, which means that you deeply love these beings. And so tell us, why do you love birds so much?
I think birds captured my imagination from when I was a child. I learned the local birds in my backyard, and I think in 2nd or 3rd grade, even drew my own little field guide of local birds. So I've always been captivated by them, and so that's what led me to study them in college.
And I'm curious also because there's a climate change mitigation component to what we're doing today, because we're increasing how much carbon can be sequestered in the land by planting trees. What's the indirect or maybe even direct relationship between the birds that we love, the land we're rehabilitating, and climate change?
So the project we're doing today, the willow staking, is really important for birds. Willows are a really important plant species for migratory birds. A lot of insect gleaners forage on willows. That's what makes this place so great, especially when the buds are emerging in the spring. As far as climate change, the birds are going to be impacted by climate change. They're going to have to adapt. So it's a really complicated question. I think it remains to be seen how certain species are going to benefit and certain species are going to be negatively impacted by climate change. Fortunately, there's a lot of citizen science projects like eBird. People are contributing data of common species. So we have baseline information, we have baseline data, so that if their numbers start declining, we'll be able to detect that.
And so what I'm hearing here is that when we actually start looking at the numbers and getting really specific about counting, about tracking what is the actual data, that helps us to create strategic plans, to respond to the problem with practical solutions based on real numbers.
Yeah, definitely. And if anything, it can maybe just inform the policymakers that there are issues or problems going on.
Yeah.
So increase the plight,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Okay. So what birds would you point out to us here at the pond?
So right now there are American coots are the blackbirds with the white bills. They're sort of like ducks, but they're not ducks. They're really common in these sort of habitats.
Can you
Just
point
in the
out the
spring.
willows so we know what we're planting is going to become?
Right, so the willows are a deciduous plant, so right now they don't look too attractive, but all of these trees are willow trees.
Okay.
They'll start to leaf out in another couple months.
So they're lining the
They completely,
shore.
they pretty much
Over there.
ring the pond. They're one of the most common plants in riparian systems. They're very quick growing. They're tolerant of disturbance. So in riparian systems, we have a lot of disturbance, whether it's flooding.
These are natural disturbances.
Natural disturbance.
Yeah.
Right. So they respond to that. They actually like that. And they're a short-lived species, quick to come up. Way in the back, you can see some more wetland vegetation.
Oh, okay.
So things like
Zoom in.
cattails and bulrushes. They like to be have their feet wet, so to speak. They like to be in perennially wet areas. And that's also really good habitat for species like red-winged blackbirds and marsh wrens. Some other species that I've observed this morning are Anna's hummingbirds. I saw a female gathering nesting material, spider webs, from a tree over here and building a nest. Black phoebes were fighting over a moth earlier.
We could
Little
probably go
squabble.
over.
Boy, you really get excited about this. That's great.
Yeah.
We could probably go over and see the hummingbirds too.
Okay.
Look, yeah.
And then we have that. Is that a palm tree?
Yeah, the random
Abandoned palm tree, not.
Is that an invasive species?
It is a non-native species. I would not call it invasive, though.
Ah.
So
Oh,
there's a discrepancy.
Please tell us. What's the
So-
difference?
There are native species and non-native species. And then within the non-native species, you have species that are weedy. You know, they maybe will grow or occur, but not necessarily spread or take over a system. Those species we call invasive. So they're going to displace the native species. And there are different levels of threats that invasive species pose. So they're usually listed in tiers. So not all non-native species are invasive, if that makes sense. So like that palm over there is a non-native species, but it's not spreading, it's not taking over. Should we take it out? Probably.
But we're not going to do that today.
We're not going to do that today. No.
Yeah. And the ones that we are taking out today are Cape Ivy.
So yes, there are a couple different ivies, Cape ivy and English ivy. They are non-native species that are invasive and will disrupt the system. So they'll climb up into the willow trees and block light out and strangle them, essentially. Make them really heavy, they'll be prone to falling over and so on during the winter rains in the wind. So that's why we're targeting those species today.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Well, how many will we have left? Who does?
I dig holes and make trail. I don't count.
My name is Allie Weller, and I've been with Apple for about 7 years, and I've been an environmentalist for a long time, for my whole life, growing up on a farm. And I noticed there are a lot of people who care about the environment who work at Apple. So I joined AppleEarth, the club, about a year and a half ago, and then I joined the core group. There's a sort of inner coordinator circle of people who want to make things happen for the rest of that club. And I saw just in the last year people catching up to the message of Greta Thunberg, to seeing what was happening with the school strikes movement. A lot of people were getting passionate about climate change, and I saw a much more increased sense of urgency. And in talking to my fellow Apple employees, I saw that people really wanted to get involved, even if it wasn't their day job. They just wanted somehow to have a tangible experience of doing something for the environment that you can then see results after a day of work and have a sense of accomplishment.
Yes.
That I did something good for the world. And so I started learning about tree planting because Ethiopia broke India's world record for a number of trees planted in a day.
Okay.
And I thought, what if Apple employees were planting trees like that? So about 8 months ago, I got very passionate about reforestation, and I started learning about the parts of the world where forests were being slashed and burned, whether intentionally or if there were wildfires. So I was learning about what was happening in Indonesia with palm oil, and Africa, lots of slash and burn for beef industry. Then, of course, South America, and then there were wildfires in Australia and California, and I just really want to get involved, even if it's something small that maybe could be scaled, first regionally, and then maybe nationally, and then maybe internationally. And so I organized a meeting of people who were concerned about Indonesia and deforestation, to see if there were people who wanted to actually plant trees. I read that tree planting is in the top 15 solutions to climate change, as assessed by Project Drawdown. That's top 15 of 80 solutions. And I'm aware that it takes all the actions. There's no one solution alone that is going to reverse climate change. We need all the solutions. And each of us needs to be doing what we're passionate about. Because I, as an individual, can't do 80 different projects. I can do maybe 1 or maybe 5. And I decided I should do what I'm most passionate about. So tree planting is one of those things. So I started asking people in the AppleEarth Club if they would be interested in tree planting events. And I got connected with the executive director of the California Conservation Corps about 7 months ago, and he made recommendations to several different Bay Area organizations that are doing tree planting. We connected with the Land Trust of Santa Cruz because they're buying the land and protecting it so it'll never get developed. So if you're planting a tree, it's not going to then get cut down and have a subdivision built over top of it. It has an easement on the land, so it's protected in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I really value, is that not only am I planting a tree for 5 years, I'm potentially contributing to a project that is planting a forest that will become mature and will be a long-term carbon sink. And so I organized this first event, and I got about 60 responses from the larger AppleEarth group saying they were interested in different locations for where they would like to plant trees. So this is the first one. Another manager reached out to me and said he'd like us to organize one for his team, just for his team, like on a weekday, maybe 30 employees. Mm-hmm. And several people said they'd love to see tree planting events in the East Bay, in Palo Alto, in Cupertino. And I know of several different organizations now who are already doing tree planting events. So this event today was an open event, which means Apple wasn't the only one the employees weren't the only ones invited. It's not an official Apple event. It's volunteers who happen to be Apple employees coming together, and the organization just didn't advertise it. So it ended up just being for us. And we planted today 482 trees is how many we planted. There were 13 volunteers, and we were able to do that in about 90 minutes. My vision is that we could have thousands of Apple employees all over the world planting millions of trees all over the world on a monthly basis. We could have a program that is more official than just ad hoc volunteers. We could have something that has unified messaging but is scalable and applies regionally so that it makes sense in the places where people actually live globally. And we could track the numbers. So like this event today that was 482 trees, that number would add to a larger number of other people planting 500 trees here, 1,000 trees here, 5,000 trees there, and we could track on an annual basis how many trees Apple employees collectively are planting. So then when individuals are doing the work, they have a broader, more meaningful sense of purpose, that they're part of something bigger than just this one event. I also found from today that I talked to the different volunteers to see how they felt after the event, and there was this tremendous sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of having made a positive difference. Even though it was only a few hundred trees, people actually walked all the land of where we did the planting. Everybody got their hands dirty. We're all wearing these big rubber boots. And we're spending time in nature with our fellow employees, getting to know each other and doing something tangible physically with our bodies that's not like what we do in our day jobs. And so now we're connecting our professional experience with something incredibly meaningful outside of the workplace that then is part of that, that storytelling of who we are. And it so connects to our values as a company. So I would love to see thousands of employees doing this monthly all over the world. I think it would make a really big difference.
That's great. Thank you for organizing this and providing the inspiration and sharing your vision.
Thank you.
Thank you.